right. Scripture reading today comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 17, verses 15 through 22, and then 18, 9 through 15. So Genesis chapter 17, 15 through 22, and 18, 9 through 15. As usual, the words are on your screen, and I invite you to read God's word along with me. Genesis 17, 15 through 22, 18, 9 through 15. Then God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, "Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." But God said, "No, but Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him, will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year." When he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. 18 verse 9. Then they said to him, "Where is Sarah your wife?" And he said, "There in the tent." He said, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah your wife will have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" And Yahweh said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old?' Is anything too difficult for Yahweh? At the appointed time I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah denied it, however, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "No, but you did laugh." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. One of the most fascinating fields of science and psychology and sociology to me, that has long marveled me and kind of got me to just wonder, is one of the greatest things that we as human beings do all collectively all the time, and that is to laugh. Scientists and sociologists and psychologists have long studied this field, and this is because while it may seem to us that laughter is quite normal and mundane, it is actually, in so many ways, quite complex, causing a bunch of really smart people to study it at length. And this is because, simply, it's not just what we always seem. Now, I Googled different types of laughter on Google. I know, not very scientific. And here's what I found off of a website called science.howstuffworks.com. I don't think it's all that scientific just because you put science in your URL, but this is what they gave me. And lists like this you can find all over the internet, and basically everyone agrees that there are indeed multiple types of laughter, but here they are. Etiquette laughter, contagious laughter, nervous laughter, belly laughter, silent laughter, stress-relieving laughter, pigeon laughter, I never understood what that one was, no matter how many times I read it, snorting laughter, canned laughter, and cruel laughter. Now, whether you agree with this list, or whether what belongs and what doesn't really matter, the point, though, is clear. There are indeed definitively multiple types of laughter that everyone uses and or experiences on a daily basis in their life. Now, what I find interesting about most of the laughter lists that I found online and otherwise is simply that there are actually two types of laughter in a category, in the sense of there's good laughter and then there's not so good laughter. Laughter isn't always good, is the point. The great kind, according to this list, are kind of like the belly laughter, where you laugh so much that your tummy hurts. Or there's the snorting laughter, if that's one of you, where you laugh so hard that an accidental snort comes out. Or stress-relieving laughter, that's when a good laugh eases some of the stress that you're feeling in your life, or a good laugh just eases the tension of a very nervous and awkward situation. But there's also the bad kind of laughter. The nervous laughter, where you know something bad is about to happen, so you laugh nervously, and or the worst, the cruel laughter, which is when you laugh at someone else's expense. So although generally laughter in our life is a good thing, we all have, at some point or another in our lives, experienced when it was not. Now you might be wondering, what does this have to do with today's text today, Pastor Pete? And it's this. This text kind of, as you can understand, the thing that makes people wonder about this text is simply, why does Sarah and Abraham laugh? Right? Like, what's with all of that? And sometimes the laughter portion is overlooked because what we kind of look at is, where's their faith? Why do they laugh? They should not have laughed, and so on and so forth. And so, although it's often overlooked, it seems to me that actually the laughter is the theme, if not one of the major themes, that ties it all together. Laughter is, to me, the key to best understand what is happening in our text today. And that's because anytime you study this text, all the scholars and the theologians, they all kind of point at the same kind of thing. Why do they laugh? Or better, what does it mean that Abraham and Sarah laugh at God or at what is announced? We all want to wonder, does it indeed mean they don't have faith? Are they mocking God even? Or at worst, or at the least, we certainly go, certainly it would have been better if they had done something other than laugh, right? And this is understandable because think about what they're laughing at or why they're laughing. Considering the fact that Abraham and Sarah had now waited long 25 years and yet still they did not have the son that was promised to them, laughing in response to this news is at least like interesting. But I think most would agree this is not a laughing matter, right? Like, it shouldn't be. But I would ask, but is it? Because to me, this is kind of the whole idea of what's happening in this text, right? This is the culmination of everything that Abraham and Sarah have been wanting and dreaming of. If you remember, this is the reason why they left their homeland in the first place, for the promise of land and nation, descendants upon descendants. And while they were told a couple chapters ago that indeed the land was going to come to them after long they have passed and died to the generations that is to come, the issue of son, without which there are no descendants, without which there are no generations to inherit the land that is to come, this is a really, really big deal. And here, when it's being cemented, when finally God gives them detail that they've never had, that all they must do is wait one more year, one short year perhaps, and you are going to have a son, how do they respond? They laugh. And to be clear, they're not laughing together. This is not like one laughing and then the other one kind of reacting to me like laughing and then this kind of, no, they're laughing separately. Both of their reactions are laughter in different ways. And it made me wonder, what kind of laugh? Is it nervous laughter? Is it the silent kind? Is it the etiquette kind? And what does this mean that they laugh? And then if you add in the fact that the name of this promised son, God names as Isaac, which means he laughs, it makes you then wonder, what is going on here? Because this is just the way I think. If I were to do this, if I were God, I'm not God, thankfully, as you know, but if I were God, this would be some sarcastic joke that reminds them, hey, remember when I told you finally you were going to get the son I promised you, and you laughed in my face? Yeah, ha, joke's on you. That's what I would have been doing. Is that what God is doing? Why remind them forever that their son is a reminder of when they laughed at the news that they were going to finally get one? What's happening here? Well, the more I dug into this text, the more I recognized, as I said, that I think laughter is the key. Because while maybe there is a better response that Abraham and Sarah could have given to God at this news, I think and I believe that laughter is a totally and utterly appropriate response to God's news. An appropriate response that later, as we will see, perhaps was even a gift, what many people call a gift of laughter. One thing that I hope that we would also gain at the end of this sermon today. Church, let me be real with you. My hope and my prayer for you today is that through this text that you would also be gifted the gift of laughter. Because I believe when we understand the promise and therefore the fulfillment of the Son, the gift that is the Son, one of the things that I hope we will do emphatically is indeed laugh. Okay? So bear with me. Now, before we dive into the text, let me quickly recap what's happening here because it's been a little bit since we've been in this story, and also if anyone's new, just a quick little recap, okay? If you remember in chapter 16, right? Sarai is frustrated that she has not yet had this son. She's been waiting a long time, right? And so you know what she says? I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to hatch this plan. Abram's going to go and have a son with Hagar, my Egyptian maid. She's much younger, right? I'm barren. We're going to do this thing. If you remember from that sermon, it's a bit of a surrogate mother type of situation that was very common in the ancient world. But things go very poorly. Why? Because once Hagar is now pregnant, right? And she's like, wait a minute, I have the promised son in my belly. Then she thinks she's something else. Then she starts disrespecting Sarai. Sarah's not having none of it, right? And then what does Sarai do? She then mistreats Sarai, aka she physically beats her. And so to survive, what does Hagar do? She flees into the wilderness. But of course, in the wilderness, a pregnant woman, right, alone in the wilderness is not going to survive. She meets God in the wilderness. God tells her, hey, you got to go back, be a slave. Hagar listens, right? Ishmael's name is God listens, or he listens, right? So then she goes back, and then everything is back to quote-unquote normal as before. Now in chapter 17, 13 years have passed since that whole incident. God appears to Abram to solidify the promise, right? Hey, you're going to have this son. First, he invites Abram to walk before him, saying, hey, you got to walk with me, be before me, be in the same page with me, yada, 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 and you're going to be Abraham, the father of nations. Then he tells Abraham, here's your part of the covenant. You got to circumcise everyone. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. And then in today's text, as I promised a few weeks ago, we get to the third character of this covenant, and that's Sarah. Remember, in the text in chapter 17, there's as for me, God, as for Abraham, and then as for Sarah. Now we get to Sarah. That's where we are, okay? Context. Now that we know a little bit of what's going on in the story, the very next thing we must do to really understand is put ourselves in Sarah's shoes. Because it's critical to know what's happening only if we are able to see it from Sarah's perspective. Now again, put yourself in her shoes. As I did, and I thought about it and just kind of dug in, I could only just imagine how difficult the past 13 years of Sarah's life must have been. Remember, after coming up with this plan that she thought was pretty cool with Hagar, everything goes to the you-know-what. Things could not have gone any worse. And then she basically forces Hagar to leave, fleeing for her life. And then when Hagar shows back up, I'm telling you, it must have not been good. And then when she finds out that it's God who tells her to come back and be a slave, all things are just really difficult, right? I mean, think about it. What is Sarah feeling when Hagar is birthing Ishmael? Not a happy day, I'm presuming. I don't know how you would feel. I just thought about it and I was like, that would not be a good day for me. And if you remember, although God promises Abraham that he's going to have his own son, there is no mentioning of Sarah being the mother of this said son. So until this moment, in this time in chapter 17, everyone is assuming that Ishmael is the son. Why? Because he is Abraham's legitimately biological son, but Sarah's left out of the picture. And even if we then presume that Sarai is raising Ishmael as her own son, as the original agreement was meant to be, can you imagine what kind of life that is? This is when it helps to be Korean. If you're Korean, we have this term called nunchi. It's where you kind of like look at everything like side eye. It's called I don't know. Anyways, nunchi, like if you don't ask somebody. Anyways, can you imagine how much nunchi is required to live in this life? I thought about it, okay? Remember, who is Ishmael? Ishmael is this wild child to be. He's supposed to be a wild donkey of a man. So imagine raising a child that's going to be a wild donkey of a man who's against everyone, everyone's against him. I'm sure your children are great, but this Ishmael probably was not the greatest kid on the planet. So you have to discipline him every once in a while, if not a lot of the times. How does Sarai feel when she has to discipline said child? If it were me, I'm overlooking my shoulder thinking about what Hagar's thinking all of the time. I mean, just imagine. All I can think is that these 13 years, though, yes, there may have been some good days, I'm pretty certain, because they're all human, we're all human, we all know what life is like, that there are a lot of days filled with high tension, high stress, where things would just blow up. I mean, no matter what Hagar says, unless she's perfect, there's got to be days where she's not doing so well in being this slave, no longer mother of Ishmael, right? Like, I mean, just think about the situation. All in all, I think it's fairly safe to presume that Sarah's life at this point, 13 years into this arrangement, isn't brimming with joy and peace and hope and goodness and gladness. I think it's quite the opposite, in fact. Now, as we imagine, we don't know for sure, but then I started digging to the text, and then I went, wait a minute, I think we're actually onto something, because what Abraham and Sarah say in our passage today kind of give us a hint that this is probably what's going on. Let me show you. Chapter 17, 15. When God is changing Sarah's name and announcing blessings twice, look at the way that Abraham responds. Remember, this is a big deal. God doesn't change people's names all over the place in the Bible. So Abraham and Sarah both get a name change, new identity, if you remember from that sermon a few weeks back, right? So big things are going on. And then God blesses Sarah twice, not only as the mother of her own son, which is a big deal because she's barren and all of that, but second, she's going to be the mother of nations, this mother of kings, tying it together, right? Abraham, the father of kings, and all this stuff. So this is supposed to be really, really great news. But look at Abraham's reaction. It's interesting. He's baffled. He can't believe what his ears are hearing. So he falls on his face and then he laughs, saying in his heart, essentially, really, God? And then he says out loud, oh God, but Ishmael. Like, let's be real here. But look at Abraham's reasoning as to why this seems to be the appropriate response for him. He goes, how could this be, God? Considering I'm old, but also Sarah's really old. If you kind of look at the text, what you find is that Abraham's understanding of Sarah is distilled down to one factor and one factor only at this point in their lives. She's old. She's an old person. Yes, she's my wife, but she's old. The hope is through Ishmael. And then, look at how Sarah reacts to the same news in the following chapter in 18. And here, her reaction gives us actually much more detail. It's much more telling, right? We're told that in verse 10, Sarah is behind a tent door listening to this conversation happening between Abraham and these three mysterious figures, who we find out later is Yahweh and then two angel-like messengers kind of thing. And then she finds out in overhearing that she's supposed to have this child 1 year from then. And then look at what we're told. Verse 11. We're told that Sarah is past childbearing old. That word childbearing in Hebrew literally means in the manner of women. A.k.a. what we're being told is that Sarah is in menopause. Not only was she barren, she was now no longer producing eggs. So physically, it is literally impossible for her to get pregnant. So the narrator is wanting to make sure that we understand exactly what the situation is. And then verse 12, look at what Sarah says after hearing the news. This is crazy. Sarah laughs to herself, and then she says, after I become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. Interestingly, that word, old, used twice in that verse, is not the same word in Hebrew. The second one means old, as in age old. But the first one does not mean old in that way. The word for old in Hebrew literally means worn out. It's a word that's used often to describe things like rags and garments that get old and worn out, tattered, haggard, ragged, as you might say. So what you're finding is Sarah's own self-identity is not wrapped up in being old. No, it's worse. Her identity is wrapped up in the idea that she's ragged, worn out, haggard, tattered, aka no good for nothing, just good enough to be thrown out. Because let's be honest, what do you do with old, ragged, tattered rags? You throw it out. It's been used. It's gotten its use, and then it's time to go. Once it's been sufficiently worn out, you let it go. And then when you dig a little deeper, many scholars agree, and I found this to be fascinating. What Sarah is actually giving is a bit of social commentary on this very simple thing. And imagine, remember, Abraham thinks she's old. She thinks she's worn out. What we're being told here is Sarah is basically saying, look, this is not going to work. Why? Because Abraham and I have not, in many, many years, even tried, let alone even thought of having any physical intimacy. And you think I'm going to get pregnant? Huh. What Sarah is letting us in on is that her self-identity is bottom of the barrel low. And although we can't know for sure because we're not told, it is very quite possible, considering the culture and the society then, that for many, many years, Abraham had been trying to have more sons with other younger maids. Why? Because if you're a patriarch in those times, one of your goals is to have as many sons as possible, because there's no guarantee that your one son is going to survive. So having many is the way of the culture so that you would indulge. Again, we're not told this, but I wouldn't be shocked if Abraham had been doing this. Why? Because he needs to produce many nations and things, do things to ensure that happens. So Sarah is off to the side, perhaps, this entire time watching Abraham trying to have more sons. And indeed, what is she? Not very useful, worn out, ragged, tattered, haggard, good for nothing, only to be perhaps thrown out in her old age. And so she laughs at the thought that someone would somehow have a child with her, and this Abraham who has lost interest in her, perhaps. So although we're not told what kind of laugh Sarah is laughing, I think it's probably one of two, but more one. If you think positively, maybe she's doing the daydreaming type of disbelief laugh. You know, like when you daydream and you're like, huh, maybe, if only, maybe. Or I think more probably, it's the negative laugh, a despondent laughter, a mockery, a scoffing perhaps, at how silly the idea sounds. But either way, what is clear is that the situation is quite bleak for all. Everyone has accepted, come to grips with the fact that the promise of son was not going to be through Abraham and Sarah, but some other way. Just like it's pouring rain outside, that's probably the way Sarah's life is going. If you don't like heavy rain, get in the fields for that, because that's how we need to empathize with how Sarah, I think, is feeling in her life. Get into a place where you felt like this in your life, where your identity and self-worth was super low and you didn't feel like you were worth anything. And then, how does God respond to this? Remember, the backdrop is, what's going on here? If you're God, you may be like, you don't believe me? Like, who do you think you are? Like, who do you think I am? Like, that kind of idea. But look at how God reacts. First with Abraham, 17:19. God's response to Abraham is actually interesting. It's very matter of fact. It's very super clear. One point after another, boom, 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 boom. If this was an email, it'd be in bullet form. No, Sarah's going to have a son, right? No, his name's going to be Isaac. No, my covenant is going to be with him and not Ishmael. But I hear about Ishmael, so he's going to be blessed. Father of princes, not kings, important. And then 5, covenant is going to be with Isaac, whom Sarah's going to burn next year. Boom, 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 boom. Matter of fact, answer, done. What I think this is, and many scholars also think, it's a gentle rebuke. No, Abraham, this is the way it's going to be. Listen to me, and we'll be all right. But then with Sarah, just like earlier, her response and God's interaction is much more interesting. We get much more information, and this is where things really start to turn. And I want you to see God's heart in all of this. Remember, if you put yourself in Sarah's shoes, you understand one thing. If you put yourself in God's shoes, again, you may be a little annoyed. You don't think I can do this? Kind of annoyed. But that's not what happens. Pay attention. First, chapter 18, verse 12. Remember, Sarah's reasons for disbelief was very sad, right? Wait, me? Worn out? This old? This barren? This useless? You're going to use me? But then what's God's response in 13? Interestingly, you find that God does not repeat any of what Sarah believes. He does not repeat and therefore does not affirm any of Sarah's own self-belief. What God is doing is purposely ignoring Sarah's reasoning so that he can refute that they do not matter at all. What God is saying is, Sarah, no, those things you think of yourself are not true. Notice what God says. He only speaks to her age. Why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? That word is the old as in age old in Hebrew. He's not going to indeed repeat and therefore affirm that she is worn out, ragged, and therefore useless. This is actually something that God does in Scripture, kind of all in different places, purposely not repeating an idea to refute that indeed is not a thing. The most prominent one that I can think of is in Luke chapter 15, the parable of the prodigal son. Do you remember the story? Right? After the son goes away, right? He's on his way back, and then he has a speech that he's rehearsing for his father, right? The thing that he's going to say. This is how he's going to apologize. And he has 3 points that he wants to make. Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, against you. Point number 1. And because I did that, I'm no longer worthy to call your son. Point number 2. And then third, because I'm no longer worthy to be called your son and I've sinned, then make me one of your hired servants. That's his pitch to his dad. But when he meets his father, The son says this, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be your son. And before he can get the third one out, what does the father do? Father interrupts, basically. You see the but, right? He interrupts, and then what does he do? He puts on a robe, then he puts the ring, and then the sandals. All three things that emphatically indicates that, no, you are my son, because servants do not get my robe, my signet ring, or sandals. You're wrong, son. You are not a servant of mine. You will always be my son. So what God is doing here with Sarah is saying, Sarah, you're wrong. I do not agree with you. Your self-understanding is totally off. You may see yourself in one way, but I clearly do not see you that way. So then we must ask, how does God then see Sarah? Well, this is where things become crazy, wonderful. Verse 14, he says, is anything too difficult for Yahweh? For me, essentially. Now, this word difficult in the Hebrew literally means wonderful. The root of this word is the word wonder in Hebrew. Now, I think the reason why most translations use the word difficult or hard, as in, is anything too hard or anything too difficult for Yahweh, is because it kind of makes sense, right? They're thinking that God can't do this, and God's basically saying, like, you think I can't do this kind of idea. But to translate it this way, I think, is to miss the richness of what God is wanting to say to Sarah in this moment, and that's the thing we need to get. This phrase, by the way, is repeated throughout Scripture in many different places, Jeremiah, so on and so forth, and New Testament, Old Testament alike. And when you survey those instances, you start to get a better idea of what this phrase is intending to say. For God to say, is anything too wonderful for me, for Yahweh, is basically this. Maybe we don't do this very often, but when you were young, I hope, you used to daydream a lot, did you not? You used to dream up these crazy things that you always wanted to do, things in the future that you thought maybe were possible, but you knew weren't possible. Let me give you an example. When I was young, I always wanted to be an NBA ball player. Okay? I know, I'm tall for a Korean, but 6'2" is not that tall in the league. Albert's back there, he's 6'6", 6'5". We got, Allen is somewhere, he's like 6'6". Even then you're just average in the league, right? But maybe Albert did this too, I dreamed that maybe one day I could get to the league. But to be dead honest, I knew this dream was nothing. I was never getting to the league, right? I was okay, I was pretty good, but I knew I wasn't even getting college offers to play. D3, come on, I was good, but I was only Asian good, if you know what that means, right? So, but I had dreams of the NBA. And so whenever these dreams I got caught up in these dreams, I would go outside to the hoop, and then I did what most kids who dream of the NBA do. You go out and you do the 3, 2, 1, and then try to hit the buzzer beater. And then if it doesn't go in, you're like, 3, 2, 1, do it again. And then, 10 times later, you still haven't hit, and you just keep going, right? All this stuff, you dream. It's wonderful to dream these things. And then sometimes you get too caught up in this dream. So I would then go in, again, I don't know if you did this, maybe this is embarrassing. I would go in and I would start putting on NBA jerseys. And then I'd put on the shorts. And then I'd put on the sweatpants, and then I'd go back outside and shoot it. Because again, it made me feel even more legitimately like maybe one day I'll make the league. But we all know where this is going. I'm not making the league. It's too wonderful, too amazing, too kind of just lofty for me to even think that would be true. This is the type of thinking and type of dreaming that make many people go oh, my heart, right? That's what parents say to the little kids when they dream of doing, oh, my heart and my brain's gonna burst. If you start to think in this way and think about who is doing the thinking and who is doing the promising, then I think what God is saying to Abraham and Sarah is simply, is anything too wonderful for me, Sarah? Is anything that you can dream of indeed too wonderful for me? And of course, the question is a rhetorical one, with the answer being undoubtedly, of course not. Now here's where I think things get really interesting. Remember I told you laughter is the key? I think that God laughs as he's saying this to Sarah. And here's why. I think God is chuckling. As he's saying this to Sarah. Sarah, is there anything too wonderful for me? Because what God is proposing is simply that nothing that you can think of is actually all that wonderful. Why? Because all of it, to me, is actually rather ordinary and mundane. You see, for Sarah and Abraham, understandably so, for us as humans, right? Because we're humans, old age, menopause, barrenness is a mountain that's way too high for them to climb and or scale. It's an obstacle way too big for them. And for us, there's many things in our life, indeed, that are too big, too high for us to scale, right? Because we're humans. It's understandable. But whatever your highest Mount Everest might be, ask yourself, what is that to God? Really? And I'm not saying it this way to make you feel bad or to belittle you. I'm not. But just think about it. Okay? Is overcoming old age, menopause, barrenness, and put any of your high Mount Everest on that list, is overcoming that much of a difficulty for the one God who created the entire universe by saying, let there be? Or better, is overcoming old age, menopause, barrenness, and your Mount Everest of choice that much of a difficulty for the one who purposely allowed himself to be crucified on a Roman cross only to resurrect 3 days later? Is it? When you put it this way, even logically, overcoming barrenness and menopause and old age, compared to those things, it's a cakewalk. And this is why I think God chuckles or laughs as Sarah's mountain is being overcome by this God, and even him being like, is there anything too wonderful for me? Because it happens in life all the time. I'm sure if you're a parent, you have done this in your life. Let me tell you why. When our children are little, especially when they're quite young, when they're this big, I saw Caleb and Eleanor and other babies. One of my favorite parts of our church right now is all these little babies. They're like literally this big. And anyone who's like normal size seem like giants to them. So what do your kids do when they come up to you when they're little? They always kind of have some challenge, especially for dads out there. Dad, can you lift this? Can you carry this? Can you dunk this? For me, it was a 9-foot hoop. I can't dunk on 10. And when they ask you, they think you can't do it. Because they think it's this big challenge, right? The classic example is, can you bicep curl me? If you haven't done this as a dad, it's like one of the cool experiences of a dad. Like, if you don't think you can do it, you're like, oh yeah, and then you like do this, like, oh. And so you do it. But then as you do it, what happens? The reason why they asked you if you could do it in the first place is because they don't think you can do it. They think it's a monumental task that's like way outside the realm of reality, but then you do it. And then when you do, what happens every single time? They have this visceral reaction of disbelief, hands on their head, jaws dropped, eyes open. I try to find a picture of an Asian kid, I couldn't do it. And all they want to do afterwards is tell all their friends, do you know what my daddy can do? Do you know what my whatever can do? This happened in my life. One time Connor went to school and he said, hey, do you know what my appa can do? And then his friend was like, what's that, bro? Oh, do you know what my daddy can do? It's all they ever want to do. Why? Because as you do it, their life is blown to smithereens. They're so full of awe and wonder. And they go, no way, did he? And what do you do as a parent? Are you offended that they didn't think that you could bicep curl them? Of course not. You chuckle. Why? Because you don't want to laugh in their face. That's mean. Because you understand what they're doing. They're trying to see and imagine if you, their hero, can do something that they think is literally impossible. So your reaction is to chuckle. And so in my opinion, God chuckles saying, oh, Sarah, oh, is there anything that's too wonderful for me? And if that's indeed what's happening here, then it got me thinking. I went, oh, wait a minute, that's it. That is it. That's the point. To me, the point of this text is simply this. It is not to be like, oh, Sarah and Abraham didn't have faith. It is not to be like, oh, God was disappointed. No. I think the point is simply this. When was the last time, church, that you and I were filled with this type of wonder? When's the last time you wondered what God could do if we just asked? And then when's the last time you actually asked God to do the thing that you didn't think he could do, that no one could do? And then if you ever watched him actually do it, then I guarantee you, like all the children of the world, would be in utter wonder, being like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe what I just saw. And all you can do in those moments is just muster. You're like speechless. You're like, I cannot even believe. There was a couple in our congregation, I won't tell you who was struggling, trying to have a baby. People in our congregation praying for them for years, I'm telling you. And then they texted me, it's like, hey, I got to talk to you. Okay, cool. I thought it was about something else. But then all of a sudden they FaceTime me. I was like, that's odd. Why do they want to FaceTime me? Slide. And then up shows the thing, and then immediately on the thing, they have ultrasound pictures. I died. No words. Just... The reason why I proclaimed at the very beginning that my hope was that you and I would be gifted this gift of appropriate laughter is because though they may not seem like it for you right now, this is the way we've always been. Do you know that? See, one of the things that happens to human beings, the reason why this is studied by many people, is simply because as we age, one thing that happens to every single person, it seems, is that we lose our sense of wonder. We lose our sense and ability to laugh in wonder, or as I said in our sermon title, to have wonderful laughter. But it's not always been this way. You know this. Children, if anything that they're sure of is the idea of wonder, they get so easily caught up in it, don't they? Take your kid to SeaWorld, see what happens. Take them to the zoo. At this time of year in Houston, the zoo is the most popular place for parents. Why? Because it's cool enough to actually go to the zoo without dying. And you go and your kids are like, oh. But it doesn't even take SeaWorld or the zoo. One time I took our kids when they were younger to the nearby park where there's ducks and geese and you can feed them. And then as we were going, we were sitting on top of this rock, and in the crevice of a rock, I wish I would have pulled the picture for you, we saw there was a nest. And those very same ducks and geese that were there, they laid some eggs. And we went nuts. Oh my, oh. Like, I forget who discovered it, screaming at the top of his or her lungs. For the first time, I took my kids out to fly a kite, and not even very good. Bought it off of Walmart. Don't do it. Buy a better one. And then we stayed out to watch the night stars. That wonder, where has it gone? When was the last time we wondered? The kind of wonder and awe and disbelief that would make our God perhaps chuckle. You see, we don't know what kind of laughter Sarah's laughing here. But to be honest, I don't think it matters. Because regardless of whether it's the good one or the bad one, God's reaction is the thing that's indeed wonderful. Because he does not react in contempt or anything. He reacts with mercy and grace and love. He goes, Sarah, did you really think that to me you are an old, worn-out rag, useless, much past your prime, and therefore useless to no one? No, my child, you are not. Why? Because I am the wonderful God, the wonderful counselor, so full of wonder that I can make even you who think you are worth nothing to be alive and full of wonder. Could it be, church, that this is what God is trying to teach us this morning? Teach us to wonder as children do. Perhaps this is why Jesus was always telling people, have a childlike faith. Not childish, childlike, those who can wonder at the marvel of God. That's why a prominent pastor in our world today, Paul David Tripp, wrote an entire book called Awe, A-W-E, the idea of being in awe of this God. I haven't read it all, I've read snippets of it, but I highly recommend it to you because it comes highly recommended by many people I trust. But then you might be saying, well, Pastor P, wait, hold up, 1 second. Okay, I get Abraham and Sarah. They had this long-awaited promise, and God's finally doing it, so maybe they were in awe and wonder. But me? My life? It's the same thing every single day. What's so wonderful about life? What promises has God made to me that I'm awaiting fulfillment? My life just seems to be the same thing day after day after day after day. There's no wonder in it. Where am I supposed to find any wonder in it? Regardless of what your life is like, there's always one thing that we can marvel and wonder at. Here it is. Remember I told you this phrase, too wonderful for me, happens throughout Scripture? The most prominent place that's connected with our passage today happens in Luke chapter 1. This is when Mary is told that she is going to have a child by an angel. And she's like, huh? What? Me? Remember, she's a virgin, no husband. And then what the angel tells her is simple. For nothing will be impossible with God. That's the same phrase in the Greek. Now what Luke is doing is actually very fascinating, because what he's doing is purposely drawing attention to the other birth narrative. There's two birth narratives. There's the birth of Isaac and there's the birth of Jesus. In the birth of Isaac, right, God is overcoming old age, barrenness, and menopause. In Mary and Jesus, God is overcoming virginity and no husband, which is harder than old age and menopause, if we're being honest. But why the connection? Well, the connection is there because we've been saying it all along, this entire series, right? The indeed promised son is not Isaac ultimately, but who is it? It's Jesus. Jesus is what many call the true Isaac. But think about it. What is the birth of Jesus doing? What in it is happening that's too wonderful that it ultimately points to? If Isaac's birth is to overcome barrenness and old age, to fulfill the impossibility of a nation of kings coming from the likes of Abraham and Sarah, well then Jesus, his birth is overcoming the virginity and no husbandness of Mary to ultimately fulfill what impossibility? Think about it. Because regardless of what is happening in our lives in any single moment, if you and I call ourselves Christian, the impossibility that Jesus' birth is eventually going to overcome is the eternal forgiveness of sin and therefore the salvation of every single sinner on the planet who repents and follows him. What is more impossible than that? You and I don't deserve to be called Christians because we're sinners. You and I don't deserve the mercy and grace of this holy God. And yet, we have it. This is why the psalmist in chapter 8, he says, "Who am I that you would be mindful of me?" Or the psalmist in chapter 139, when he's wondering and realizing that God knows everything about us in our most parts, when we rise, when we sleep, all those things. And then what does he say? Ultimately, he goes, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too high I cannot comprehend." Infertility, sure, that is a tough one to overcome. Virginity, no husband, yes, that is indeed tough one to overcome. Whatever your Mount Everest is, indeed tough to overcome. But the eternal condemnation of sin and the rendering of death utterly useless, there's nothing more impossible and therefore wonderful than that, friends. Who else could? Better, who else would? Oh, the wonder that our God would conquer the impossibility of sin and death by sacrificing his own perfect Son, the spotless Lamb, to be crucified by the very sinners he came to save, so that the crucifixion would be the thing that washes us of our sin. It is impossible to fathom. Advent is coming. I would advise you prepare your heart for the most glorious thing the world has ever seen outside of the cross. But let's finish. In chapter 21, verses 6 through 7, not much of it here because Pastor Chris is going to preach it in a couple weeks. Interesting what Sarah says in chapter 21. Remember I told you my hope and my prayer is that we would recover our ability to laugh and wonder, the gift of wonderful laughter. And it's because of this. Look at what Sarah says. This is after Isaac is born, by the way. She goes, "God has made laughter for me." everyone who hears will laugh with me. Now, when you study this passage a little bit, scholars will debate whether the laugh with me should be better laugh at me, because in the Hebrew it's laugh at me. But I think it's actually the word laugh at me. Because for a Sarah who was so despondent of her life and what her life condition was, and though her troubles and all those things are very legitimate, very true, and very hurtful, I think what Sarah discovered and what God gave her in light of who he is and what he is capable of, how wonderful, how gracious and merciful he is that she then recognizes even that the idea of a 90-year-old woman literally breastfeeding a child is just straight up funny. Look at what she says. That a 90-year-old woman breastfeeding, that's comedy. So why laugh at me? Because in light of what God has done, Sarah has learned I should not take myself and my difficulties too seriously. Why? Because this child that I'm holding in my hand, feeding from my own 90-year-old breast, is just funny. Shouldn't be, but it is, because God is wonderful. The Alcoholics Anonymous have this book of daily reflections that they published. And in it, one of the entries is called The Gift of Laughter. Let me read for you. It's very short. He says, before my recovery from alcoholism began, laughter was one of the most painful sounds I knew. I never laughed, and I felt that anyone else's laughter was directed at me. So my self-pity and anger denied me the simplest of pleasures or lightness of heart. By the end of my drinking, not even alcohol could provoke a drunken giggle in me. Then he continues. So when my AA sponsor began to laugh and point out my self-pity and ego-feeding deceptions, I was annoyed and hurt. Think about that. Laughing at an alcoholic as a sponsor. Anyways. But it taught me to lighten up and focus on my recovery. I soon learned to laugh at myself, and eventually I taught those I sponsor to laugh also. Why? Because every day I ask God to help me stop taking myself too seriously. Church, let's be honest. The realities of life at times, they're too much. Can we? And when they're too much, we lose very quickly our ability to laugh and smile and therefore wonder. But no matter the circumstance of life, if you are blessed with the blessing of being called God's son and or daughter, the bride of Christ even, then may we never lose the wonder that God would save you and me. That his grace and mercy is impossible. It should not be. That his grace and mercy is only possible because his son dies for our sin. That we have a God who is much more faithful than we could ever fathom nor imagine. That we have a God who takes all of our scorn and shame, rendering them useless on the cross, and even then taking the blood that he shed to then wipe us of our sin to make us white as snow. And therefore we should say, oh God, would you teach us to laugh even at ourselves, because my sin is not as bad as I think, because your grace is so wonderful that it takes all of my wretchedness and makes them useless. You are not worn out and ragged. You are the eternal sons and daughters of the King who would go to hell and back so that you could be his. Is there anything more wonderful than this? Church, would you wonder? Perhaps when you look yourself in the mirror, would you wonder? That which I see in the mirror, I am the cherished bride of the Most High God. His mercy never ends. His grace is forever. And no matter what happens here, the promise is one day I will be with him forever. Glory be to his name, and may you indeed be gifted with the gift to laugh in wonder, a full of wonder, therefore wonderful laughter. and find that our God somehow, some way is smiling, delighting in you because he has saved you despite and in spite of your sin. May you never lose the wonder of God's mercy. Church, we're about to sing that song by Matt Redman in a second. Wonder of God's mercy. May you proclaim it with all that you have and be filled with wonder this day and onward.